Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar on global ESG regulatory trends and materiality assessments. What does this mean for you? This event is sponsored by Kroll. As a leading independent provider of risk and financial advisory solutions, Kroll leverages our unique insights, data, and technology to help our clients stay ahead of complex demands. Kroll's global team of more than 6,500 professionals worldwide continues the firm's nearly 100-year history of trusted expertise spanning risk, governance, transactions, and valuations. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to cover some brief housekeeping items. This webinar is being broadcast live. We suggest you enlarge your media player to full screen when viewing the presentation. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. You can submit questions electronically through the webcast console Q&A widget. If we don't have a chance to answer every question during this webinar, we will be sure to follow up with you after the presentation. You have the option to engage with speakers by using the reactions widget to send emoticons. Part of our presentation will address our ESG and global investor return study that you may download by simply clicking the button on your screen. A recording of today's webinar will be posted to our website over the next few days. This presentation qualifies for 1 CPE credit, and you must complete 4 of our polling questions during the presentation to be eligible. I'm Julianne Racine, a managing director at Kroll, and I oversee Kroll's ESG advisory services practice. My colleague, Chris Dessat, is a managing director in the ESG advisory practice, and he serves as a trusted advisor to clients on ESG and sustainability-related matters. My colleague, Carla Nunes, is a leading expert on a variety of valuation, financial reporting, and tax issues. She is an author of numerous cost of capital and goodwill impairment publications and advises on a mixture of complex cross-border valuation issues. Carla is also a co-author of Kroll's ESG and Global Investor Return Study, which we will cover during today's webinar. We have the pleasure of Zoe Koskinas joining us. Zoe is a vice president and head of ESG of Compass Diversified. She is responsible for the firm's ESG strategy and works closely with the portfolio companies to integrate the firm's ESG across the businesses. So before we kick into the presentation, we have our first polling question. What is your primary role or function as it relates to ESG and or sustainability? Please select one. A, sustainability officer, head of ESG. B, risk officer. C, compliance or legal. D, finance accounting. E, investor, business development. Or F, other, not applicable. Please take a moment now to make your selection. Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, great. Seems that we have a number of finance and accounting folks here with us today, as well as in legal and compliance. And I'm glad to see that we do have a number of sustainability officers and head of ESG. So let's jump into the presentation. So there continues, I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead, Carla, do you want to kick off? I was just going to mention that there continues to be a great deal of confusion regarding
yes, go
ESG.
ahead.
And, you know, just ESG and sustainability and how firms address that for their business practices. How organizations view ESG is generally influenced by stakeholders or investors and also by current regulation. And there are certain jurisdictions that may be further along than others. And as we know, there's a number of convergence initiatives as well as it relates to ESG and voluntary frameworks and standards. So Carla, please kick this off and walk us through the background of ESG and sustainability disclosure standards.
Thanks, Julianne. And yeah, so I'm sure everyone who's on this call has heard about greenwashing and the fact that a lot of times it appears that companies are and funds are disclosing something that may not be completely the same as what is actually being done. And part of the issue is, unfortunately, it's the lack of consistency and standardization about what these terms mean, because even the term of ESG versus sustainability can mean something different. This project called Carrots and Sticks, just to give you an example, says that in 2020, when they looked at all of the reporting provisions around the world, they had identified 600, and almost 60% of those were mandatory. Whereas in 2023, when they expanded their database to 130 countries, they were already identifying 2,400 different provisions for, voluntary or mandatory, but 55% were voluntary in nature. So this leads to a lot of confusion. And also get standard setters and regulators to intervene. And so that's what we've been seeing over the last couple of years and will continue to do so. So as an example of the land of confusion of, what you have to deal with in terms of reporting frameworks, governing principles, the number of rating agencies that provide ESG scores. There's different data aggregators and investor resources, and frankly, this is a wild west. It really is overwhelming to see what you should be looking at and comply with, and making sure that you're meeting your obligations, whatever position you have within the firm. So this has led to the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, which, just a little refresher again, this is just background. Some of you may be very aware of this. That was created in 2021 following, large support after the COP26 in Glasgow. And the IFRS Foundation now oversees two boards. The ISB, so the responsible board for setting international reporting standards, and the ISSB, so the ISSB being the Sustainability Disclosure Standards, which itself is an aggregation of a number of other standard setters that were out there, and they were voluntary in nature. So they aggregated in 2022 the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and the Valley Reporting Foundation, which itself was already an aggregation or a merger of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, and the International Integrated Reporting Council, IIRC. And some of these, including SASB, for example, were already widely used voluntarily by a number of corporations and in some cases funds to their portfolio companies. And in 2024, so now the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, which has served as the base for most of the proposals and standards out there with regards to climate disclosures, it's now going to come under the umbrella of the ISSB. So let's look at a couple of proposals or standards that are already finalized out there that have a potentially a global reach on the corporate side, and then we'll look at the funds as well. So on the corporate side, the ISSB, which we just talked about, has finalized its first two standards. The first is a general standard on sustainability, and the second is climate-related disclosures. There's some, things that can be postponed, but for whatever jurisdictions that end up adopting ISSB, the first standard, S1, would be the first one that needed to be complied with. The European Union has also been very active in this space, and they adopted the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So like, from now on, we probably will be talking about CSRD. That's what it means. And the actual standards on sustainability, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS, were also finalized in 2023, and they were developed by EFRAG. Now, both of these are sector agnostic in both the ISSB and EU, but sector-related standards are also being developed. We now have the UK, and the UK government, one of their branches, issued the UK Sustainability Disclosure Standards for corporations, and they're very much in line with ISSB, so IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. So the idea here is, they're still in development, but the idea is that they'll try to align them with the ISSB, and only if strictly necessary would they diverge. And of course, so we can see in Europe and in some other jurisdictions, things are really ahead of the curve. Whereas in the US, there's been a little bit more pushback, a little, maybe is a soft term, pushback on what to do in this arena. So the SEC has proposed in 2022 a climate-related disclosures requirements that would come into the annual reporting. So the 10Ks would have to disclose these types of risks and opportunities. Well, at least risks, opportunities if the filer would choose to. But there's been a lot of pushback. The latest from the SEC is that they're intending to finalize, after receiving thousands and thousands of comment letters, to finalize by April of this year. We'll see, because it has been postponed a number of times. It was supposed to be finalized earlier, and but that's what we're in the horizon looking at. And of course, we can't forget that the state of California, which, Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about it, that they're already like farther ahead than the SEC.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carla. And first off, let me say it's great to be here with both my esteemed colleagues and Zoe Koskinas, who's a friend and always someone who's great to speak with on these topics. But yeah, to Carla's point, first off, is I'd love to hear the crystal ball predictions of what the SEC ends up doing, hopefully in April or at least sometime this year. But yeah, the state of California, and I think we've seen this with other subnational governments too, New York and Illinois have also considered legislation that is looking to adopt ESG and or sustainability related disclosure requirements. And so we saw earlier this year that the state of California adopted really two pieces of legislation. The first relating to greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, and then the second, these were both passed at the same time. We're going to talk about in a moment some of the threshold requirements for these, but the second is around climate-related financial risk disclosures. And so, in line with Carla's point, very much we're seeing an emergence of converging standards in national and subnational governments looking to provide specific guidance and requirements around ESG and sustainability related disclosures. And I know Julianne is going to talk a little bit about, this is what we've seen on the corporate side. Julianne's going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing on the fund side, and what's happening with private funds. Julianne, over to you.
Sure, great. So, as Chris mentioned, we've talked a lot about what's been happening on the corporate side. There is certain initiatives and some regulation that is far-reaching over to the private fund space. So in the EU, we have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is known as SFDR, and that generally focuses on greater transparency of sustainable investment products. And that's to be sure that those funds or those investment vehicles are doing what they're saying. Most of these products are put into the categories of Article 6 8, or 9. And with those, there come a great deal of reporting requirements. Within Article 9, there tends to be a lot more reporting than the others, but nonetheless, it's something to be focused on. In the UK, under the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, we have what is referred to as the UK Sustainability Disclosure Requirements, known as SDR. The focus here as well is to provide greater transparency and consistency in the market for sustainable investment products, and also to clamp down and focus on greenwashing. So just to clarify, SFDR affects EU-based entities as well as the products marketed in the EU. So that's regardless of location. So if you're a US fund manager and you're marketing your product within the EU, you would have to disclose under this regulation. And SDR generally applies to issuers of bonds and shares listed on a UK regulated market and UK-based investment managers. We talked about the SEC sort of dragging its feet a bit on the corporate side, and we are all anxiously awaiting what that disclosure requirement is going to be. But within the private fund space, there's been an amendment to the fund names rule. And the fund's name rule generally states that a fund would need to adopt a policy to invest at least 80% of its assets in the manner that's suggested by the fund's name. So originally, the rule applied to funds names that suggested a particular focus on the investment strategy, that focused on a particular industry or geography. It has since been amended to expand and consider what is referred to as particular characteristics, and ESG or sustainability factors falls under that area of being a particular characteristic. So if a fund has any ESG or sustainability related word in its name, it needs to be sure that 80% of its investments meet those funds' characteristics and should be able to disclose that within their marketing material, policies, prospectuses, et cetera. California, again, we mentioned how California is ahead of things. California is also implementing something that will take place in 2025 that is referred to as the California Fair Investment Practices by Investment Advisors, or SB 54. And this law is going to affect venture capital firms headquartered in California, and they need to report upon the diversity of the founders that they are backing. So VC firms will have to aggregate and provide data points on the disability status, also the race, and in certain cases, also sexual orientation of the founders of those firms they are investing in. So, so lots for us to focus on and to be ahead of. So we covered a lot here, and I guess we'd just like to communicate to you, and I'm going to ask Chris to help us. What does this all mean for you, for those of you listening here to our webinar?
Yeah, thanks, Julianne. And you know, at the end of the day, you know, there's a lot of acronyms. It's a lot of legislation. What we want to communicate at the end of the day is, and we genuinely see this literally every day in terms of our clients being surprised by the fact that they're going to be subject to this legislation. So if you look at corporate legislation, and you know, we just saw from Julianne, there's a ton of fund-related legislation, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, if you look at the CSRD that Carla, you know, mentioned, and you look at the two pieces of California legislation, again, this is not exhaustive. We could look at each of the other pieces of legislation, but we wanted to focus on these because of the thresholds. If you look, we're talking at the lowest end, you're talking EU 40 million, you know, euros, and it applies to both.
In revenue, right, Chris?
In revenue, and it applying to both public and private entities. So that's shocking to many businesses. And you know, Zoe can talk about this and others. It's most businesses right now are having to really grapple with whether one of their affiliates or their subsidiaries might get picked up by this legislation. Again, it's public and private. These are organizations that may have may not be familiar with even doing financial reporting on a regular basis, let alone sustainability related reporting. And we're going to talk about in a minute, looking at some of the requirements, namely materiality assessments, but we're also talking about ultimately disclosures around a wide swath of environmental, social, and governance issues up and down your supply chain. And so you can see, we're talking public and private. We're talking about some of the timing on these issues is already for 2024 data that has to be reported in 2025. Now, that's for certain large issuers and organizations that are probably better prepared for this. But our point is here to say many organizations are going to be shocked and are shocked by the fact that they're going to get picked up by this directly. The same is true if you look at California. We're talking about revenue thresholds, and it's gross revenue. It may look high. You say, oh, it's US 500 million for SB 261. That's the financial risk piece. 1 billion for the 253, which is the greenhouse gas emissions. That's global revenue. And that's for a business that has $1 of business in the state of California. And so when you think about it in those terms, we're talking thousands and thousands. Just the EU CSRD, there's an estimate that that's going to pick up 50,000 businesses. Okay, maybe it's 50,000, maybe it's less, but that's direct. Then there's the other point, which is, yeah, but all that's going to trickle down when those businesses have to report information coming from their supply chains. So organizations that are in the supply chain are also going to get picked up by this legislation. And so the general point I think we wanted to make here, and I'm sure my colleagues at Zoe and others will comment on this, is this is going to apply to a lot of people. Carla mentioned the pushback in the US. We're kind of in a funny place in some sense, I think, and maybe we can talk about this, but where there is pushback, but on the other hand, we're moving to a framework globally where, if anything, things are getting, in some sense, more regulatorily legislated and required. So it's this interesting combo.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yeah, lots happening there, and to your point, even though there might be pushbacks in certain jurisdictions, there's still a lot to comply with, and depending upon where you're operating and where you continue to conduct your business, you will need to comply with some of these regulations. So Zoe, within your organization and the work that you're doing, how have these sort of shifts in all this regulation been affecting you and the companies you invest with?
Yeah, I think Chris made some really good points there around shock and being shocked, and it's really hard to sort of keep up with all the moving parts. But to avoid our organization and our subsidiaries from that shock, we're just making an assumption, while there are a lot of rolling parts, that we're just going to fall under it in some way, shape, or how. And so what we're doing as an organization and working with our subsidiaries is then making assessments and putting down the foundation and using all these different types of tools, such as materiality assessments, going through current regulations, going through current trends, and saying, what can we meaningfully take on now, and how can we start to create a timeline, and what does that look like if this regulation was to apply to us? So because we have lots of different companies in different verticals, those all mean different things. And so we then also have to rely on experts in those industries and those industry standards and going through there. But I think really sitting down and putting together a meaningful plan around what is going to apply immediately and starting now, because a lot of our companies are already doing a lot of these things. It's more just having the structure, and this is where this regulation helps. And I will say, not getting caught up in the political discourse in the US, because having worked across the globe in different countries, you do see patterns. You do see things that have happened in the EU still coming over to the US. It's still going to happen regardless. Companies that have a global footprint or global minded in nature, they're not silly to this sort of political thing that's going on. They're still going to do these things, whether it's regulation or not.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Okay, that leads us to our next polling question. What is your firm's level of preparedness to address ESG and sustainability disclosure regulations? A, fully prepared and ready for reporting. B, hired or refocused internal staff to evaluate our regulatory requirements. C, hired or considering working with a third party to assist with the process. D, do not know where to begin. E, unaware of my firm's level of preparedness. And F, other or not applicable. And you could choose more than one for this polling question. And I also want to mention, if anyone has a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A anytime during the presentation. We're happy to get to things, especially if it's appropriate at this time with the content that we're discussing. So please use the Q&A function. Thank you. Okay. So let's see the results. What is your firm's level of preparedness to address ESG and sustainability disclosure regulations? Okay, well, it's good. Looks like folks are hiring internal staff to evaluate the regulatory requirements, and also groups that are considering working with a third party, which is exciting. And that's some of the work that we do here at Kroll and our ESG advisory group is, we're talking about how to prepare here, and I'm going to ask Chris again to take us through sort of the process and some of the work that we do a lot here, which is with the materiality assessments. So Chris, how does a firm prepare? How do we address and prepare ourselves to follow through with ESG initiatives?
Yeah, before jumping in, I love those results. It's good to see. Yes, in hiring internal staff, and yes, doing things to prepare. That's a good sign. First thing is, in my past life, I was an attorney, a securities lawyer, and the first thing that certainly we have to talk about is doing a deep kind of regulatory assessment, right? So to Zoe's point, I do think it's a great approach to say, how do you think about like the lowest or highest common denominator and prepare for this legislation, even if it's not applicable to you today? But I do think, the obvious thing is you should be speaking with and liaising with external counsel and really doing a deep dive on, is the legislation definitely going to apply or not to you, and thinking about that from a timing standpoint. And then practically, whether or not you're subject to it now, but if you think you're at risk of being subject to it, the most important thing is really to take a sober look at where you're at. So you need to know where you're at. And people call that a lot of different things. They refer to it as a gap analysis. It's really just taking a snapshot, and there are different ways you can do that. The most important we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the materiality assessment. Cannot overstate how important that is, but it's also looking at your policies and procedures. It's looking at the data you have. It's really taking an introspective look, saying, okay, here's where we're at. And then to Zoe's point, it's then saying, okay, how are we going to come up with reasonable goals and objectives at the highest level? And that means having, again, kind of a sober look at what you actually can do. And that goes to the board, it goes to the C-suite. And then practically it's going through milestones and thinking of a roadmap with very detailed and very prescriptive milestones on where do you need to be and when. And that's really, one of the, challenging things here is knowing this is going to have to be an evolutionary process for most organizations on the policies and procedures front. So it's knowing where do you have to be over the next, short, medium, and long term, and then really thinking about that in terms of specific milestones, both from the disclosure side, but also from a substantive and managerial side.
So Zoe, why don't you tell us a little bit about your organization's ESG journey?
Yeah, I can kick off by answering Sarah's question. We have a question in the Q&A because that can lead to where we sort of started our journey as well. Sarah's question is that her company is considering a materiality assessment. She's received a few proposals. It's quite expensive. Should she wait until the company has the budget, or should she start doing something now? And so having started this whole process in various companies, it's always sort of been the same approach, is internally having a conversation about what we're trying to achieve with a materiality assessment, because I've seen materiality assessments done and then, okay, we did it, that's great, what's next? And they sort of just let it go off to to wherever it lives in the back corner. So it's around, what are we trying to get out of the materiality assessment, and how can we start with using our expertise internally? You may be the only person who you think has the expertise, but you'd be wrong. There's HR, there's no function that this doesn't go across. So using your internal expertise as a start, you can certainly then lean on sort of some free resources that are out there to help you start thinking about this, while you're then engaging with third-party consultants to eventually start this materiality assessment. So where I started was, I was able to do it myself, leaning on different resources, leaning on people internally, leaning on my prior knowledge. And then I've been able to work with Kroll to be able to do a materiality assessment with my company and 4 of our subsidiaries. And so it's almost it is actually the evolution of my own work and my company's own work at the very start. And now the evolution of having Kroll come in and help us look at the regulation, look at the standards, look at the reporting frameworks, help us speak to our investors, help us speak to our community groups, in which we didn't know we had to do some of these things, but we had a start, we had a foundation, we were able to hand this over to Kroll, they were able to help us a little bit more. And it's going to keep evolving and evolving and evolving. And with that, and as your budgets grow and you get more research resources, you're able to evolve with it. So bottom line, just start. Do something and start, and then evolve.
Great. So yeah, and that's what we have conversations with folks, or even just speaking to people about it. I think the term, for whatever reason, is a bit overwhelming, or folks think, oh my gosh, what do I have to do here? But to conduct a materiality assessment. But, and I'm sure Zoe, you could comment. It's sort of an introspective look to really understand, what your company's goal is and how to achieve that goal. So, Chris, would you like to walk us through the differing types of materiality assessments? And there's a lot of terminology used of what is the financial or single materiality or traditional versus double materiality, and also what we also know as impact materiality.
Yeah, let me start with the following. I think this is the good news story of all this, right? We've just overwhelmed you with, hey, there's a lot of converging legislation. Hey, the standards are getting, in some sense, more sophisticated, but also more challenging. The big message here with materiality is this is meant to help you as an organization identify the things that matter to you as an organization and or your stakeholders, right? Like at the end of the day, this is sifting through the noise. And if anything, I think this, Carla started with greenwashing, right? As one of the risks, precisely because of that, materiality is so important, because you really cannot be all things to all people. You cannot be all things to all people. I don't know how many times we could tell that to organizations, but there's a lot of pressure on organizations, right, to be all things to all people. But what this does is allow you to really focus on what matters. And when we talk about the different ways of going about a materiality assessment, there are different approaches. One, and these are really heuristic devices in the sense that it's really how you look at materiality. Historically, organizations like SASB and even ISSB and others, and the SEC, I'm a securities lawyer by training. This tends to be my historical training, was to say, look, does it impact your financial performance, and if sustainability information in areas that impact your financial performance, that's clearly material, i.e. it impacts revenue, impacts cost of capital. We can talk about all those things, but that's what we think of as traditional materiality. Europe, and this really comes historically from the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and thinking about things slightly differently. And Zoe can talk about this, about how it's really a different lens through which to see the world. Has introduced this concept of double materiality, and what's really meant by that is that instead of looking at the world only through how it impacts your financial performance, it's looking at the issues, impacts, risks, and opportunities that impact the world. And you think, well, that's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but it's really intuitive as you do that kind of assessment, because really what you're looking at is, as a business, your products, services, and operations are causing impacts in this wide, broad way. Hence this idea of looking in your supply chains, hence looking at human rights issues, hence looking at your scope emissions, because you're taking this 360-degree look at your business. And now people are, let's just be frank, people in the US are very skeptical about this, but the reality is, A, it's required in the EU now. So we talk about CSRD, it's a requirement that you do it this way. But even if it wasn't a requirement, what we have found is it's actually a really good way to see issues that are bubbling up from an enterprise risk perspective. So it's valuable not only from the perspective of it's required, it's valuable as a methodological process to identify risks as they're bubbling up in your business. And then just very practically here, and we could spend hours on this, but I'll run through this really quickly for the audience. What are we talking about when we're doing a materiality assessment? Well, really it's four steps. It's one, it's defining your approach. Things like, are you going to do a double materiality assessment? Are you going to align with CSRD? Are you going to align with FRAG? Are you going to align with, there's a lot of initial strategic thinking about what are you trying to get out of your materiality assessment. The next step is to cast a wider net than things that are going to be material, namely things that are potentially material. So these are relevant. You don't want this to be 100 different things, but in general, we find that somewhere between 30 to 40 potential issues. If you look in the market, you'll see that that's generally market practice. And that is to say, look at the universe of potentially relevant issues. The next step is to say, now you conduct the kind of introspective deep dive. You can use third parties. You can use your internal resources. To Zoe's point, you want this to be cross-functional. You want this to be cross-functional. That's a really, really important message. And you, at that point, are looking at and doing the analysis of what things are strategic to your business, meaning they directly relate to value creation, value preservation, what things are required of your business, i.e., legislatively, you have to report on it. That's true about a lot of climate related and environmental topics. And what are those things that are bubbling up that aren't material, but that you want to be monitoring? And then lastly, and this is maybe the hardest part, is you have to determine thresholds. Again, getting back to the theme, you can't be all things to all people. And this is the time where you say, all right, look, we're going to focus on our core issues. We're going to focus on what's core to us. We're going to report under the standards, knowing that, and that can always be revised, and it's dynamic and it's going to change over time. And then I'll end with this last note, which could be a whole series itself, is under some of this legislation, and I saw that there are a bunch of folks from finance and accounting here. This is for them. The materiality itself, estimate process itself, is also in some cases subject to assurance and attestation. And what that ultimately means is A, you need to follow the prescriptive methodologies that are required, but B, document, document, document. This is going to be like and should be treated like your financial and accounting data and processes. And so I'll end with that. That's maybe a pitch for a future webinar, because that's a can of worms in and of itself.
So Zoe, I think during your process and working with us that you chose to conduct a double materiality assessment. Was there anything during this process that surprised you or made you feel really good about taking this initiative and moving forward?
Yeah, to piggyback some of Chris's points, I think the focus that the materiality assessment creates, as well as having a double materiality, in terms of you can't be all things to everyone, as Chris says, it helps show that methodology, because different things are important to different people, and you have many stakeholders, and you're going to get the question of, oh, well, why isn't this a strategic priority? This is important to the world, or this is important to me, and I'm one of your highest, investors. And so you're able to say, well, we've taken into consideration all different, looking inside out, looking inside in, and talking to all of our shareholders, and we're able to focus it. And this is why, and this is the methodology, and this is why it makes sense, and this is why it's important to you and to us. So a huge thing around focus there, which I was surprised how much it's able to then, people are able to understand that. So that makes sense. I'm on board for that. Whereas if you're having the conversation around, oh, well, we just thought it was important, it's sort of like, well, there's no buy-in. Second part to Chris's point again is the enterprise risk management and how it's helped embed sustainability and ESG across all the different functions, especially when you own 10 companies, as we do, helping them resource and helping them understand who has this expertise and how are we going to integrate that into our strategy, our business strategy. What does that mean for our business strategy? And then what that does mean is that it creates a lot of opportunity. And the part that I'm most surprised about and I love the most is the opportunity creation. And so being able to allocate resources to the opportunity side of things is basically saying there's an invitation to innovate here and capture the market, especially if you're looking at the impact side, not just the financial side. So what are we doing to the world? What do the consumers want? Well, they want innovation. They want better products. They want better materials. Okay, let's innovate around that.
Okay, thank you. Leads us to our next and third polling question. Has your firm conducted a materiality assessment? Please select one. A, conducted a traditional single or financial materiality assessment. B, conducted a double materiality assessment. C, intend to begin the process. D, have not considered it yet. E, unaware whether my firm has conducted an assessment. And F, other or not applicable. We're really looking forward to seeing these responses. And please, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If we don't get to them during the webinar, we're happy to reach out afterward. And please, afterward, feel free to reach out to any of us here on the panel. Chris, any predictions here on this response?
Yeah, I'm going with A.
All right, let's take a peek.
Let's see.
No. Oh, well, okay.
Okay. That's positive. I'm excited.
Right.
I'm excited that folks are intending to begin the process. We'd love to hear that. Music to our ears. And look, it's something new to certain groups. I think we'll see a lot more folks focusing on materiality assessments. And again, we're happy to answer any questions as it relates to it. So now that we've done, some of you have done that work of materiality assessment or are intending to commit to it. And there's a lot of work involved here, as Chris brought us through. And ultimately, I feel that it's an opportunity to increase the longer term value for your organization. And now we're going to hear from Carla Nunes, who's going to talk to us about ESG ratings and how they impact the returns on your organization. Thank you, Carla.
Thanks, Julianne. And actually, what you just said about an opportunity to create long-term value, I come from a valuation standpoint. And to me, I should be looking, when I'm looking at the value of an investment, at all the risks and opportunities that are material that should be considered in a projected cash flow approach. And so materiality is going to be a crucial process in incorporating ESG type factors or sustainability type factors in evaluation, because obviously there's all kinds of risks and opportunities out there, and any investor would consider them to the extent that they have an impact on value, meaning they're actually material. So I am actually looking forward to that journey, to learn more about this, as companies and investors start reflecting their materiality assessments. And in fact, that sort of leads us why we actually put together this study, because we started getting a lot of questions from our project teams, particularly in Europe, about, hey, how are you incorporating ESG type factors in your valuation? Are you doing it in your projected cash flows? Are you doing it in the cost of capital? And auditors to our project teams were doing this work. They were doing valuations for a variety of purposes. The auditors were asking our project teams, how did you reflect it in the valuation? And so they would come to us, like we're like the Office of Professional Practice, so like the think tank, if you will, for our group of like where the latest guidance is and what the best practices are for valuation. And we sort of didn't have an answer. And so back in 2020, I was actually thinking of this, like, oh, we need to start looking into this. And maybe the first step is to see, how do investors care? Is it reflected in the stock prices? But of course, COVID happened. And so we had to postpone the project a little. And we finally started working on it again. And we released our study back in September of 2023, so very recently. And we wanted to do a global study, because these questions are across the border, not just in a single country. So we included a universe of over 13,000 publicly traded companies around a variety of geographies and industries around the globe. And we looked at the relationship between a company's total stock returns and its rating. And we had to go through the process of in the next slide, I'll show you why we picked MSCI as the rating agency or provider for ESG ratings. But that's what we picked. And this encompasses the period of 2013 and 2021, partly because that's when we started the study. We didn't have the 22 data, but also because of all that's happening in 22, including things that have nothing to do with sustainability, like the surge in inflation across the globe, the increase in interest rates that led to a material drop in valuations in 2022 that have since recovered. But the point is that there's a lot of noise. So our study goes through 2021 and has a number of geographies and like 11 industries. So why did we pick MSCI? Because I'm sure you've heard a lot of criticisms about ESG ratings providers. And in fact, there are current proposals in the EU, for example, and in the UK. The UK, something came out already, but it's voluntary in nature. But the EU is planning on putting together a proposal. They already put something out that would say, if you are providing some type of ESG opinion or score to EU investors, you would have to be sort of accredited, like for a lack of a better word, with the EU, and that means going through ESMA. So the ESMA is the European securities regulator, similar to the SEC in the US. But the reason we picked MSCI is because we wanted to. Number one, we wanted a long coverage period, because if you want to look at a pattern, like do investors care, you can't just have 2 years of data. It's meaningless. You know, you need to have a longer period of time. We also wanted to have a lot of companies that were publicly traded for which we could measure returns. And we wanted to make sure that once a rating has been assigned, if something happens that it's material to that company in terms of ESG, that the rating would change. So in other words, some of the providers we looked into, they kept the same rating the entire year and never changed it. The other thing we wanted to make sure is that there was an overall ESG ratings, not just climate. And finally, we wanted a methodology like MSCI has, which is focused on what we just heard about, financial materiality, because in order to understand whether investors care from just a return standpoint, we wanted to make sure that it has an impact. How do these factors have an impact on the financial bottom line, as opposed to the opposite? How much of our activities are impacting the world, the planet, and people? That's not directly correlated with the financial impact. So we wanted a methodology that focused on that. And so MSCI really won by a large margin compared to other providers that we looked at, and we looked at a number of them. So the reason why we picked 2013 was also a function of data availability. When you do studies, you want to make sure that they are statistically significant. And so in 2013, MSCI increased significantly the number of companies that they rated in terms of ESG. So that's why we picked 2013. The way that MSCI ratings work is they also use letter ratings like the credit rating agencies, but they're not exactly the same. And so if you are a AAA or a AA, that means that you're a leader in terms of managing your significant ESG risks and opportunities. If you are on the other end of the spectrum, a B or a CCC, you're a laggard. You're not doing as much. And anything in the middle, like A, BBB, and BB, they're considered average. So this is their rating system. So you understand the results of our study. But this is not the same as credit ratings. I just wanted to pause a little there because people complain a lot about how informative are ESG ratings, because there's a lot of discrepancy between providers. And it's normal because they have very different methodologies. And we have to understand that a credit rating, so when S&P, Moody's, or Fitch, for example, provide a credit rating, they're measuring something really different. They're really just measuring whether you have the ability to pay your debts, right? ESG is a much, much broader concept. And so because of that and the lack of available data in a lot of places, you are going to have a lot of discrepancies between providers. They'll have different methodologies because you're not measuring you know, what you're able to pay your debts, right? But I believe that as this new regulation comes in to try to have a little bit more uniformity between methodologies, that will probably, and as more data becomes available as part of these regulatory developments, we'll also see a little bit more consistency between providers. Now, just wanted to highlight that overall ESG rating is not the same as climate. So for example, Tesla, we're seeing on the screen, you know, you could argue that they have a top score when it comes to the E, the environmental section, but not necessarily in terms of governance and in terms of social. And so their rating is not a leader. So remember, like leader, it would be AAA and AA rated, and they're not, you know, based on MSCI ratings. So just making that distinction. And so what did we do to create this study? And then we'll go through the results. So we created portfolios every single month between the January 2013 and December 2021. We calculated what, you know, each portfolio would be comprised of companies that had a specific rating. So a portfolio of only AAA rated companies, a portfolio of only CCC rated companies, etc. And then we calculated what would it take if you invested $1 at the beginning of the period, how much would you have at the end? You know, and so of course that's a cumulative return, how much you made over that period. So we annualize those returns, so you could get like an annual rate of return to see, compare between the different ratings. And everything is in US dollars because we needed to compare, you know, different geographies, and we have companies from 100 plus countries in here, so we needed to be able to compare everything in a common currency. Just to give you a sense, the 52% of the observations actually come from US, Japan, China, and UK. And of course, US being the largest. And that makes sense, right? Because they have the greatest amount of publicly traded companies. But these had to be companies that were rated by MSCI. You know, we have more details on the study that you can always download the PDF for the methodology, just to give you a sense. So what did we find? We found that if we invested $1 at the beginning of the period, and they looked at the end of the period, that the green line there, which are the leaders globally, they earn more money. So the total returns were higher than the lower rated companies, like that's the orange punch color at the bottom. And it even earned more than the MSCI All Country World Index, so the global index that is like a common benchmark for investors. And so, but we care about annual returns, as I said, as opposed to $1 invested. And so this is what it looks like for a global portfolio or a world portfolio. We can see that you know, the leaders earn almost 50% more during this period than the laggards. So 12.9 versus 8.6. And this was true across different regions. The one thing I wanted to highlight is like the number of companies that were in each of the portfolios will vary every single period, because some companies go bankrupt, some companies get acquired, there's M&A going on, and then there's IPO. So there will be different number of companies every single month. So to give you a sense, we're showing in the last column how many companies as of December 2021 were distributed amongst the various rating categories, leader, average, and laggard. And on a global scale, only 13% were considered leaders of the companies that are included in our study. So there's a little bit more of a bias towards, like, you know, your average or a laggard, which is 24%. But if you look
Carla, I apologize to interrupt. It's just we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I want to be sure we get to the next polling question.
Yes, and
some folks
thank you.
Off.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to go through this very, very quickly. So the only thing I was going to say is that, yes, North America had the same pattern, but they had, you know, only 10% of leaders. And if we go to Europe, which again, you know, leaders have earned more than laggards, but they're much further ahead in their journey. So about 34% compared to the other sets were actually considered leaders. So it just tells you that Europe is farther ahead in terms of reflecting ESG factors in their strategic initiatives. And so, but things can change between industries. So this is true for, you know, for example, in the US for financials, but then for energy, laggards actually earned a higher return. Even though it wasn't great, they earned a higher return during this period. So you have to look at this with, you know, a little bit of grain of salt, meaning that, you know, there is some value that investors are ascribing to those companies that are ahead of the curve, but it's not consistent across necessarily industries. And so you have to be careful in analyzing these factors across the industry. So this is not a straightforward exercise. And from a valuation standpoint, I wouldn't include it necessarily an ad hoc adjustment in discount rates and cost of capital. And so, you know, we have some caveats. And we have a couple of slides there that you could see what the impact on ESG could be in business valuations, what kinds of line items you should be looking at to help you go through that journey. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Julianne to go through the last polling question.
Great, thank you. Last polling question. Does your firm typically incorporate ESG, sustainability impacts, risk, or opportunities into your decision-making process? You can select more than one. A, yes, as part of compliance. B, yes, as part of our due diligence process and or M&A activity. C, yes, we consider them as part of our strategic planning. D, we do not currently consider ESG or sustainability factors, but plan to start considering them. E, there are no plans to consider ESG or sustainability in the future. F, other, not applicable.
Yeah, and I'm curious because, as you said, Julianne, in this case, you can select more than one option. So it is possible that people are doing it as part of due diligence or part of compliance or and other factors or not, you know. So I'll be curious to see the answer.
Hopefully lots of C's.
Part of strategic planning. That's right.
Okay. So let's see. Great. Hey, I'm glad to hear. And this is, you know, and then you do have quite a number of C's there. All right.
Right.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We apologize if we didn't have a chance to get to your questions during this webinar. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us and enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, or whatnot. Take care now.